Hegel's Philosophy of Mind, Section 2, The Objective of Mind, Subsection C, The Moral Life, or Social Ethics, dialectical, Meta-section CC, The State, Quantum section Beta, External Public Law, Das äußere Staatsrecht, Encyclopedia section 547. In the game of war, the independence of states is at stake. In one case, the result may be the mutual recognition of free national individualities. See Encyclopedia section 430. And by peace conventions supposed to be forever, both this general recognition and the special claims of nations on one another are settled and fixed. External state rights rest partly on these positive treaties, but to that extent contain only rights falling short of true actuality. See Encyclopedia section 545. Partly on so-called international law, the general principle of which is its presupposed recognition by the several states. It thus restricts their otherwise unchecked action against one another in such a way that the possibility of peace is left, and distinguishes individuals as private persons, non-belligerents from the state. In general, international law rests on social usage. Hegel's Philosophy of Mind, Section 2, The Objective of Mind, Subsection C, The Moral Life or Social Ethics, dialectical, Meta-section CC, The State, Quantum section Gamma, Universal History, Die Weltgeschichte, Encyclopedia section 548. As the mind of a special nation is actual, and its liberty is under natural conditions, it admits on this nature side the influence of geographical and climate qualities. It is in time, and as regards its range and scope, has essentially a particular principle on the lines of which it must run through a development of its consciousness and its actuality. It has, in short, a history of its own, but as a restricted mind, its independence is something secondary. It passes into universal history. It passes into universal world history, the events of which exhibit the dialectic of the several national minds, the judgment of the world. Encyclopedia section 549. This movement is the path of liberation for the spiritual substance, the deed by which the absolute final aim of the world is realized in it. And the merely implicit mind achieves consciousness and self-consciousness. It is thus the revelation and actuality of its essential and complicated essence, whereby it becomes the outward eye of a universal spirit, a world mind. As this development is in time and in real existence, as it is a history, its several stages and steps are the national minds, each of which, as single and endowed with nature, but its several stages and steps are the national minds, each of which, as single and endued by nature with a specific character, is appointed to occupy only one grade and accomplish one task in the whole deed. The presupposition that history has an essential and actual end from the principles of which certain characteristic results logically flow, is called an a priori view of it, and philosophy is reproached with a priori history writing. On this point, and on history writing in general, this note must go into further detail that history, and above all universal history, is founded on an essential and actual aim, which actually is and will be realized in it, the plan of providence. That, in short, there is reason in history, must be decided on strictly philosophical ground, and thus shown to be essentially and in fact necessary. To presuppose such aim is blameworthy only when the assumed conceptions or thoughts are arbitrarily adopted and when a determined attempt is made to force events and actions into conformity with such conceptions. For such a priori methods of treatment at the present day, however, those are chiefly to blame who profess to be purely historical, and who at the same time take opportunity expressly to raise their voice against the habit of philosophizing, first in general and then in history. Philosophy is to them a troublesome neighbor, for it is an enemy of all arbitrariness and hasty suggestions. Such a priori history writing has sometimes burst out in quarters where one would least have expected it, especially on the philosophical. uh, Such a priori history writing has sometimes burst out in quarters where one would least have expected it, especially on the philological side, and in Germany, more than in France and England, where the art of historical writing has gone through a process of purification to a firmer and maturer character, fictions like that of a primitive age and its primitive people possessed from the first of the true knowledge of God, and all the sciences of sacerdotal races, and when we come to minutiae of a Roman epic, supposed to be the source of the legends which pass current for the history of Rome and other histories, or the history of ancient Rome and its conquests, have taken the place of the pragmatizing which detected psychological motives and associations. There is a wide circle of persons who seem to consider it incumbent on a learned and ingenious historian, drawing from the original sources, to concoct such baseless fancies, and form bold combinations of them from a learned rubbish heap of out of the way and trivial facts in defiance of the best accredited history. Setting aside this subjective treatment of history, we find what is properly the opposite view forbidding us to import into history an objective purpose. This is, after all, synonymous with what seems to be the still more legitimate demand that the historian should proceed with impartiality. This is a requirement often and especially made of the history of philosophy, where it is insisted there should be no prepossession in favor of an idea or opinion, just as a judge should have no special sympathy for one of the contending parties. In the case of the judge, it is at the same time assumed that he would administer his office ill and foolishly if he had not an interest, and an exclusive interest in justice. If he had not that for his aim and one sole aim, or if he declined to judge at all. This requirement, which we may make upon the judge, may be called partiality for justice. And there is no difficulty here in distinguishing it from subjective partiality. But in speaking of the impartiality required from the historian, this self-satisfied, insipid chatter lets the distinction disappear and rejects both kinds of interest. It demands that the historian shall bring with him no definite aim and view by which he may sort out, state, and criticize events, but shall narrate them exactly in the casual mode he finds them, in their incoherent and unintelligent particularity. Now, it is at least admitted that a history must have an object, ergo Rome and its fortunes, or the decline of the grandeur of the Roman Empire. But little reflection is needed to discover that this is the presupposed end, which lies at the basis of the events themselves, as of the critical examination into their comparative importance, in essence, their nearer or more remote relation to it. A history without such aim and such criticism would be only an imbecile mental divagation, not as good as a fairy tale. For even children expect a motif in their stories, a purpose at least dimly surmisable, with which events and actions are put in relation. In the existence of a nation, the substantial aim is to be a state and preserve itself as such. A nation with no state formation, a mere nation, has strictly speaking no history, like the nations which existed before the rise of states, and others which still exist in a condition of savagery. What happens to a nation and takes place within it has its essential significance in relation to the state, whereas the mere particularities of individuals are at the greatest distance from the true object of history. It is true that the general spirit of an age leaves its imprint in the character of its celebrated individuals, and even their particularities are but the very distant and the dim media through which the collective light shall play and even their particularities are but the very distant and the dim media through which the collective light still plays in fainter colors. Ay, even such singularities as a petty occurrence, a word, express not a subjective particularity, but an age, a nation, a civilization, in striking portraiture and brevity. And to select such trifles shows the hand of a historian of genius. But on the other hand, the mass, but on the other hand, the main mass of singularities is a futile and useless mass. But on the other hand, the main mass of singularities is a futile and useless mass, by the painstaking accumulation of which the objects of real historical value are overwhelmed and obscured. The essential characteristic of the spirit and its age is always contained in the great events. It was a correct instinct which sought to banish such portraiture of the particular and the gleaning of insignificant traits into the novel, as in the celebrated romances of Walter Scott and the others, where the picture presents an unessential aspect of life. It is certainly in good taste to conjoin it with an unessential material, such as the romance takes from private events and subjective passions. But to take the individual pettinesses of an age and of the persons in it, and in the interest of so called truth, weave them into the picture of general interest is not only against taste and judgment, but violates the principles of objective truth. The only truth for mind is the substantial and underlying essence, and not the trivialities of external existence and contingency. It is therefore completely indifferent whether such insignificancies are duly vouched for by documents. or, as in the romance, invented to suit the character and ascribed to this or that name and circumstances. The point of interest of biography, to say a word on that here, appears to run directly counter to any universal scope and aim. But biography too has for its background the historical world, which but biography too has for its background the historical world with which the individual is intimately bound up. Even purely personal originality, the freak of horror and such, suggests by allusion the central reality and has its interest heightened by the suggestion. The mere play of sentiment, on the contrary, has another ground and interest than history. The requirement of impartiality addressed to the history of philosophy, and also we may add to the history of religion, first in general and secondly to church history, generally implies an even more decided bar against presumption of any objective aim. As the state was already called the point to which in political history criticism had to refer all events, so here the truth must be the subject to which the several deeds and events of the spirit would have to be referred. What is actually done is rather to make the contrary presupposition. Histories with such an objective as religion or philosophy are understood to have only subjective aims for their theme, in a sense only opinions and mere ideas, not an essential and realized object like the truth, and that with the mere excuse that there is no truth. On this assumption, the sympathy with truth appears as only a partiality of the usual sort, a partiality for opinion and mere ideas, which all alike have no stuff in them and are all treated as indifferent. In that way, historical truth means but correctness, an accurate report of externals without critical treatment such in that way, historical truth means but correctness, an accurate report of externals without critical treatment save as regards this correctness, admitting in this case only qualitative and quantitative judgments, no judgments of necessity or notion. See for reference notes to sections 172 and 175. See for reference notes to Encyclopedia sections 172 and 175. But really, if Rome or the German Empire and the British Empire, or an actual and genuine object of political history, and the aim to which the phenomena are to be related, and by which they are to be judged, then in universal history the genuine spirit, the consciousness of it, and of its essence, is even in a higher degree a true and actual object and theme, and an aim to which all other phenomena are essentially and actually subservient. Only therefore through their relationship to it, in essence through the judgment in which they are subsumed under it, while it inheres in them, have they their value and even their existence. It is the spirit which not merely broods over history as over the waters, but lives in it and is alone in its principle of movement. And in the path of that spirit, liberty, in essence, a development determined by the notion of spirit, is the guiding principle, and only its notion, its final aim, in essence, truth. For spirit is consciousness. Such a doctrine, or in other words, that reason is in history, will be partly at least a plausible faith, partly it is a cognition of philosophy. Encyclopedia section 550. This liberation of mind, in which it proceeds to come to itself and to realize its truth, and the business of so doing, is the supreme right, the absolute law. The self consciousness of a particular nation is a vehicle for the contemporary development of the collective spirit in its actual existence. It is the objective actuality in which that spirit, for the time, invests its will. Against this absolute will, the other particular natural minds have no Against this absolute will, the other particular natural minds have no rights. That nation dominates the world, but yet the universal will steps onward over its property for the time being. Encyclopedia section 550. This liberation of mind, in which it proceeds to come to itself and to realize its truth, and the business of so doing is the supreme right, the absolute law. The self consciousness of a particular nation is a vehicle for the contemporary development of the collective spirit in its actual existence. It is the objective actuality in which that spirit, for the time, invests its will. Against this absolute will, the other particular natural minds have no rights. That nation dominates the world, but yet the universal will steps onward over its property for the time being, as over a special grade, and then delivers it over to its chance and doom. Encyclopedia section 551. To such extent as this business of actuality appears as an action, and therefore as a work of individuals, these individuals, as regards the substantial issue of their labor, are instruments, and their subjectivity, which is what is peculiar to them, is the empty form of activity, what they personally have gained therefore through the individual share they took in the substantial business, prepared and appointed independently of them, is a formal universality of subjective mental idea, fame in which is their reward. Encyclopedia section 552. The national spirit contains nature necessity and stands in external existence. Encyclopedia section 423. The ethical substance, potentially infinite, is actually a particular and limited substance. See Encyclopedia sections 549 and 550. On its subjective side, it labors under contingency in the shape of its unreflective natural usages, and its content is presented to it as something existing in time and tied to an external nature and external world. The spirit, however, which thinks in this moral organism, overrides and absorbs within itself the finitude attaching to it as natural. The spirit, however, which thinks in this moral organism, overrides and absorbs within itself the finitude attaching to it as national spirit in its state and the state's temporal interests. In the system of laws and usages, it rises to apprehend itself in its essentiality. Such apprehension, however, still has the eminent limitedness of the national spirit, but the spirit which thinks in universal history, stripping off at the same time those limitations of the several national minds and its own temporal restrictions, lays hold of its concrete universality and rises to apprehend the absolute mind as the eternally actual truth in which the contemplative reason enjoys freedom, while the necessity of nature and the necessity of history are only ministrant to its revelation and the vessels of its honor. The strictly technical aspects of the mind's elevation to God have been spoken of in the introduction to the logic. See for reference, especially Encyclopedia section 51 and the note. As regards the starting point of that elevation, Kant has, on the whole, adopted the most correct, when he treats belief in God as proceeding from the practical reason. For that starting point contains the material or content which constitutes the content of the notion of God. But the true concrete material is neither being, as in the cosmological, nor mere action by design, as in the physical theological proof, but the mind, the absolute characteristic and function of which is effective reason, in essence, the self determining and self realizing notion itself, liberty. That the elevation of subjective mind to God, which these considerations give, is by Kant again deposed to a postulate, a mere ought, is the peculiar perversity formerly noticed of calmly and simply reinstating as true and valid that very antithesis of finitude, the supersession of which into truth is the essence of that elevation. As regards the mediation, which, as it has been already shown, see for reference section 192 and the note for Encyclopedia section 204. As regards the mediation, which, as it has been already shown, that elevation to God really involves the point specifically as regards the mediation, which, as it has been already shown, that elevation to God really involves, the point specially calling for note is the moment of negation through which the essential content of the starting point is purged of its finitude so as to come forth free. This factor, abstract in the formal treatment of logic, now gets its most concrete interpretation, the finite, from which the start is now made, is the real ethical self-consciousness, the negation through which the consciousness rises, the negation through which the consciousness raises its spirit to its truth, is the purification actually accomplished in the ethical world, whereby its conscience is purged of subjective opinion and its will from the selflessness of desire. Genuine religion and the genuine religiosity only issue from the moral life. Religion is that life rising to think, in essence, becoming aware of the free universality of its concrete essence. Only from the moral life and by the moral life is the idea of God seen to be free spirit. Outside the ethical spirit, therefore, it is vain to seek for true religion and religiosity. But as the case with all speculative process, this development of one thing out of another means that what appears as sequel and derivative is rather the absolute prius of what it appears to be mediated by, and what is here in mind known as its truth. Here then is the place to go more deeply into the reciprocal relations between the state and religion, and in doing so to elucidate the terminology which is familiar and current on the topic. It is evident and apparent from what has preceded that moral life is the state retracted into its inner heart and substance, while the state is the organization and actualization of moral life, and that religion is the very substance of the moral life itself and of the state. In this religion, at this rate, the state rests on the ethical sentiment and that on the religious. If religion, then, is the consciousness of absolute truth, then whatever is to rank as right and justice, as law and duty, in essence, as true in the world of free will, can be so esteemed only as it is participant in that truth, as it is subsumed under it and is its sequel. But if the truly moral life is to be a sequel of religion, then perforce religion must have the genuine content. but perforce religion must have the genuine content. In essence, the idea of God it knows must be the true and real. The ethical life is the divine spirit as indwelling in self consciousness, as it is actually present in a nation and its individual members. This self consciousness retiring upon itself out of its empirical actuality and bringing its truth to consciousness has in its faith and in its conscience only what it has consciously secured in its spiritual actuality. The two are inseparable. There cannot be two kinds of conscience, one religious and another ethical, differing from the former in body and value of truth. But in point of form, in essence, from thought and knowledge, and religion and ethical life belong to intelligence and are a thinking and knowing, the body of religious truth. As the pure self subsisting and therefore supreme truth exercises a sanction over the moral life which lies in empirical actuality. Thus, for self consciousness, religion is the basis of moral life and of the state. It has been the monstrous blunder of our times to try to look upon these inseparable as separable from one another and even as mutually indifferent. The view taken of the relationship of religion and the state has been that, whereas the state had an independent existence of its own, springing from some force and power, religion was a latter addition, something desirable perhaps for strengthening the political bulwarks, but purely subjective in individuals. Or it may be, religion is treated as something without effect on the moral life of the state. In essence, its reasonable law and constitution which are based on a ground of their own. As the inseparability of the two sides has been indicated, it may be worth while to note the separation as it appears on the side of religion. It is primarily a point of form, the attitude which self consciousness takes to the body of truth. So long as this body of truth is the very substance or indwelling spirit of self consciousness in its actuality, then self consciousness in this content has the certainty of itself and is free. But if this present self consciousness is lacking, then there may be created, in point of form, a condition of spiritual slavery, even though the implicit content of religion is absolute spirit. This great difference, to cite a specific case, comes out within the Christian religion itself, even though here it is not the nature element in which the idea of God is embodied, and though nothing of the sort even enters as a factor into its central dogma, and sole theme of a God who is known in spirit and in truth. And yet in Catholicism, this spirit of all truth is, and yet in Catholicism, the spirit of all truth is in actuality set in rigid opposition to the self conscious spirit. And, first of all, God is the host presented to religion, adoration as an external thing. In the Lutheran Church, on the contrary, the host as such is not at first consecrated, but in the moment of enjoyment. In essence, in the annihilation of its externality, and in the act of faith, in essence, in the free, self certain spirit, only then is it consecrated and exalted to be present God. From that first and supreme status of externalization flows every other phase of externality, of bondage, non spirituality, and superstition. It leads to a laity receiving its knowledge of divine truth as well as the direction of its will and consciousness from without and from another order, which order again does not get possession of that knowledge in a spiritual way only, but to that end essentially requires an external consecration. It leads to the non spiritual style of praying, partly as mere moving of the lips, partly in the way that the subject foregoes his right of directly addressing God and prays others to pray, addressing his devotion to miracle-working images, even to bones, and expecting miracles from them. It leads generally to justification by external works, a merit which is supposed to be gained by acts and even to be capable of being transferred to others. All this binds the spirit under an externalism by which the very meaning of spirit is perverted and misconceived at its source, and law and justice, morality and conscience, responsibility and duty are corrupted at their root. Along with this principle of spiritual bondage and these applications of it in the religious life, there can only go in the legislative and constitutional system a legal and moral bondage, and a state of lawlessness and immorality in political life. Catholicism has been loudly praised, and is still often praised, logically enough, as the one religion which secures the stability of governments. But in reality, this applies only to governments which are bound up with institutions founded on the bondage of the spirit, of that spirit which should have legal and moral liberty, in essence, with institutions that embody injustice and with a morally corrupt and barbaric state of society. But these governments are not aware that in fanaticism they have a terrible power which does not rise in hostility against them only so long as and only on condition that they remain sunk in the thraldom of injustice and immorality. So, because the church is there, the Catholic Church, does not mean that the state is adhering to it. But in mind, there is a very different power available against the externalism and dismemberment induced by a false religion. Mind collects itself into its inward free actuality. Philosophy awakes in the spirit of governments and nations the wisdom to discern what is essentially and actually right and reasonable in the real world. It was well to call these products of thought, and in a special sense, philosophy, the wisdom of the world. Weisheit. For thought makes the spirit's truth and actual present, leads it into the real world, and thus liberates it in its actuality and in its own self. So the author here, Hegel, through William Wallace, is saying the Catholic Church's institutions are rightly called the world's best, and if they're applied, either directly through the church or through a government, they can do a lot of good. But if people don't have a philosophical underpinning, which underpins every priest, every bishop, every cardinal, they have a philosophy. If the people themselves don't have it, he argues that their souls, their minds can't in actuality be free, and that what they have is a false religion, false meaning a diminutive, not a true religion, which is elevating. Thus set free, the content of religion assumes quite another shape. So long as the form and essence are consciousness and subjectivity, lacked liberty, it followed necessarily that self consciousness was conceived as not immanent in the ethical principles which religion embodies. And these principles were set at such a distance as to seem to have true being only as negative to actual self consciousness. And this unreality ethical content gets the name of holiness, but only the divine spirit introduces itself into actuality. The actuality emancipates itself to spirit. Then what in the world was a postulate of holiness is supplanted by the actuality of moral life. Instead of the vow of chastity, marriage now ranks as the ethical relation. And therefore, as the highest on this side of humanity stands the family. Instead of the vow of poverty, muddled up into a contradiction of assigning merit to whosoever gives away goods to the poor, in essence, whosoever enriches them, is the precept of action to acquire goods through one's own intelligence and industry, of honesty in commercial dealing and in the use of property, in short, moral life in the socio-economic sphere and instead of the vow of obedience, true religion sanctions obedience to the law and the legal arrangements of the state, an obedience which is itself the true freedom, because the state is a self possessed, self realizing reason. In short, moral life in the state. Thus and thus only can law and morality exist. The precept of religion, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's, is not enough. The question is to settle what is Caesar's, what belongs to the secular authority, and it is sufficiently notorious that the secular, no less than the ecclesiastical authority, have claimed almost everything as their own. The divine spirit must interpenetrate the entire secular life, whereby wisdom is concrete within it, and it carries the terms of its own justification, but that concrete indwelling is only the aforesaid ethical organizations. It is the morality of marriage as against the sanctity of a celibate order, the morality of economic and industrial action against the sanctity of poverty and its indolence, the morality of an obedience dedicated to the law of the state as against the sanctity of an obedience from which law and duty are absent, and where conscience is enslaved. With the growing need for law and morality in the sense of the Spirit's essential liberty, there sets in a conflict of spirit with the religion of unfreedom. It is no use to organize political laws and arrangements on principles of equity and reason, so long as in religion and principle, so long it is no use to organize political laws and arrangements on principles of equity and reason, so long as in religion the principle of unfreedom is not abandoned. A free state and a slavish religion are incompatible. It is silly to suppose that we may try to allot them separate spheres, under the impression that their diverse natures will maintain an attitude of tranquility one to another and not break out in contradiction and battle. Principles of civil freedom can be but abstract and superficial, and political institutions deduced from them must be, if taken alone, untenable, so long as those principles and their wisdom mistake religion so much as not to know that the maxims of the reason in actuality have their last and supreme sanction in the religious, conscious, in subsumption under the consciousness of absolute truth. Let us suppose even that, no matter how a code of law should arise, so to speak a priori, founded on principles of reason, but in contradiction with an established religion based on principles of spiritual unfreedom, still as the duty of carrying out the laws lies in the hands of individual members of the government, and of the various classes of the administrative personnel, it is vain to delude ourselves with the abstract and empty assumption that the individuals will act only according to the letter or meaning of the law, and not in the spirit of their religion, where their inmost conscious and supreme obligation lies. Opposed to what religion pronounces holy, the laws appear something made by human hands, even though backed by penalties and externally introduced. They could offer no lasting resistance to the contradiction and attacks of the religious spirit. Such laws, however sound their provisions may be, thus founder of the conscience, whose spirit is different from the spirit of the laws and refuses to sanction them, it is nothing but a modern folly to try to alter a corrupt moral organization by altering its political constitution and code of law without changing the religion, to make a revolution without having made a reformation. To suppose that a political constitution opposed to the old religion could live in peace and harmony with it and its sanctities, and that stability could be procured for the laws by external guarantees, ergo so called chambers, and the power given them to fix the budget, and such things. See for reference section, Encyclopedia section 544, note. At best, it is only a temporary expedient when it is obviously too great a task to descend into the depths of the religious spirit and to raise that same spirit to its truth, to seek to separate law and justice from religion. Those guarantees are but rotten bulwarks against the consciences of the persons charged with administering the laws, among which laws these guarantees are included. It is indeed the height of profanity of contradiction to seek to bind and subject to the secular code the religious conscience to which mere human law is a thing profane. The perception had dawned upon Plato with great clearness of the gulf which in his day had commenced to divide the established religion and the political constitution on one hand from those deeper requirements which, on the other hand, were made upon religion and politics by liberty, which had learnt to recognize its inner life. Plato gets hold of the thought that a genuine constitution and a sound political life have their deeper foundation on the idea, on the essentially and actually universal and genuine principles of eternal righteousness. Now to see the now to see and ascertain what these are in certainty Now, to see and ascertain what these are is certainly the function of the business of philosophy. It is from this point of view that Plato breaks out into the celebrated or notorious passage where he makes Socrates emphatically state that philosophy and political power must coincide, that the idea must be regent, if the distress of nations is to see its end. What Plato thus definitely set before his mind was that the idea, which implicitly indeed is the free self determining thought, could not get into consciousness save only in the form of a thought, that the substance of the thought could only be true when set forth as a universal, and as such brought to consciousness under its most abstract form. To compare the Platonic standpoint in all its definiteness with the point of view from which the relationship of state and religion is here regarded, the notional differences on which everything turns must be recalled to mind. The first of these is that in the natural things, their substance or genus is different from their existence in which that substance is as subject. Further, that this subjective existence of the genus is distinct from that which it gets, when specially set in relief as genius, or to put it simply, as the universal in a mental concept or idea. This additional individuality, the soil on which the universal and underlying principle freely and expressly exists, is the intellectual and thinking self. In the case of natural things, their truth and reality does not get the form of universality and essentiality through themselves, and their individuality is not itself the form. The form is only found in subjective thinking, which in philosophy gives the universal truth and reality an existence of its own. In man's case, it is otherwise. Its truth and reality is the free mind itself, and it comes to existence in his self consciousness, this absolute nucleus of man. Mind intrinsically concrete is just this, to have the form, to have thinking itself for a content. To the height of the thinking consciousness of this principle, Aristotle ascended in his notion of the entelechy of thought, thus surmounting the Platonic idea, the genus or essential being, but thought always, and that on account of this very principle contains the immediate self subsistence of subjectivity, no less than it contains universality. The genuine idea of the intrinsically concrete mind is just as essentially, under the one of its terms, subjective consciousness, as under the other, universality. And in the one as in the other, it is the same substantial content. Under the subjective form, however, fall filling, intuition, pictorial representation, and it is in fact necessary that in point of time the consciousness of the absolute idea should be first reached and apprehended in this form. In other words, it must exist in its immediate reality as religion, earlier than it does as philosophy. Philosophy is a latter development from this basis, just as Greek philosophy itself is later than Greek religion, or later than Greek religion, and in fact reaches its completion by catching and comprehending in all its definite essentiality that principle of spirit which first manifests itself in religion. But Greek philosophy could set itself up only in opposition to Greek religion. The unity of thought and the substantiality of the idea could take up none but a hostile attitude to an imaginative polytheism and to the gladsome and frivolous humors of its poetic creations. The form and its infinite truth, the subjectivity of mind, broke forth at first only as a subjective free thinking, which was not yet identical with the substantiality itself, and thus this underlying principle was not yet apprehended as absolute mind. Thus, religion might appear as first purified only through philosophy, through pure self existent thought, but the form pervading this underlying principle, the form which philosophy attacked, was the creative imagination. Political power, which is developed similarly, but earlier than philosophy, from religion, exhibits the one sidedness which in the actual world may infect its implicitly true idea as demoralization. Plato, in common with all his thinking contemporaries, perceived this demoralization of democracy and the defectiveness even of its principle. He set in relief accordingly the underlying principle of the state, but could not work into his idea of it the infinite form of subjectivity which still escaped his intelligence. His state is therefore, on its own showing, wanting in subjective liberty. See Encyclopedia section 503 note, Encyclopedia section 513, and similar. The truth which should be immanent in the state should knit it together and control it. He, for these reasons, got hold of only the form of thought, out truth, of philosophy. And hence he makes that utterance that so long as philosophers do not rule in the states, or those who are now called kings and rulers do not soundly and comprehensibly philosophize, so long neither the state nor the race of men can be liberated from evils. So long will the idea of the political constitution fall short of possibility and not see the light of the sun. It was not vouchsafed to Plato to go on so far as to say that so long as true religion did not spring up in the world and hold sway in political life, so long the genuine principle of the state had not come into actuality, but so long too this principle could not emerge even in thought, nor could thought lay hold of the genuine idea of the state, the idea of the substantial moral life, with which is identical the liberty of an independent self-consciousness. Only in the principle of mind, which is aware of its own essence, is implicitly in absolute liberty and has its actuality in the act of self-liberation. Does the absolute possibility and necessity exist for political power, religion, and the principles of philosophy coinciding in one, and for accomplishing the reconciliation of actuality in general with the mind, of the state with the religious conscious as well as with the philosophical consciousness? Self realizing subjectivity is in this case absolutely identical with substantial universality. Hence, religion as such and the state as such, both as forms in which the principle exists, each contain the absolute truth, so that the truth in its philosophic phase is after all only in one of its forms. But even religion, as it grows and expands, lets other aspects of the idea of humanity grow and expand also. See section, Encyclopedia section 500 in its sequence. As it is left therefore behind, in its first immediate and so also one sided phase, religion may, or rather must, appear in its existence degraded to sensuous externality, and thus in the sequel become an influence to oppress liberty of spirit and to deprave political life. Still, the principle has in it the infinite elasticity of the absolute form so as to overcome this depraving of the form determination and of the content by these means, and to bring about the reconciliation of the spirit in itself. Thus, ultimately, in the Protestant conscience, Thus, ultimately, in the Protestant conscience, the principles of the religion and of the ethical conscience come to be one and the same. The free spirit learning to see itself in its reasonableness and truth. In the Protestant, but more likely the Reformed, Catholic, or Presbyterian state, the Constitution and the Code, as well as their several applications, embody the principle and the development of the moral life, which proceeds and can only proceed from the truth of religion when reinstated in its original principle, and in that way, as such, first become actual. In the Reformed the United Reformed Church, which is a Reformed Catholic Church, or the Presbyterian Church, or the non Calvinist Church of Geneva, there are philosophical doctrines which are studied along with Scripture, and a priest administers the normal rites as well. Whereas in the Roman Catholic Church, those things are only reserved for the priests, the bishops, and the cardinals, and a few other religious people. And so the argument here is that the way of the Reformed Catholic Church is the more ideal way. You'll find that under United Reformed Church or a Presbyterian Church would have those uh, morality. So some people will attend Catholic Mass and take the sacrament from a Roman Catholic church, a cathedral, and then they will attend a United Reformed church and not take the sacrament that they offer there, but sit in their congregation and learn. The reader here has been at least inducted or initiated within the Presbyterian or United Reformed Church movement. And I'm also a confirmed Catholic. I also am a DNA Jew. And so I do my best to combine those things together. And I have a permission within the Islamic tradition as well as others. So this is called perennialism, where you don't claim to be that all religions are true. You don't claim that. You go in either into your birth religion, from Judaism, or into the various churches of the world, and you take the right, usually on paper or some other method, a handshake, and you say, "Can I learn this?" And you do. And they watch you, they know you, and you go through the process, and then you collect them together, and you're able to speak on them philosophically, which is not normal, really, to any religion except for the United Reformed Church. Uh, in the last sentence of subsection C, the moral life of the state and the religious spirituality of the state are thus reciprocal guarantees of strength. The next section, section 3, is absolute mind, der Absolutgeist, beginning with Encyclopedia section 553.